Sometimes when you're building a database application, you don't have the data set ready. It's being built by some other member of the team, but you need to get started on your logic and on your user interface. The live binding system that's part of C++ Builder exe3 has a component called the aPrototypeBindSource, which allows you to prototype what the data set might look like, build your application with some sample data, and then when you get the real data set, just reconnect your user interface to the new data set. So this video, I'm going to show you how to use the PrototypeBindSource and then get a real data source and hook it up to the user interface that you set up. So we'll say File, New, C++ Builder FireMonkey desktop application. I'm going to right mouse click and bring up the live bindings wizard, and I'm going to link a grid with a data source. We'll just use the T-grid. You've seen this before. I say for the new data source, I normally was using a BindSource DBX because I had a data set, but there's another option here, aPrototypeBindSource. I'm going to choose that, and the aPrototypeBindSource lets you create some sample data to work with. So here's my user interface with the grid. I'm going to put a label up here. We'll bring up the live binding designer so we can see what's happening underneath. Here's my navigator and my bind source. And so far, I don't have any data inside of the data source. So let's add some data. The way we do that is right mouse click, bring up the fields editor, or choose add field. And here are a bunch of different data types. There are two checkboxes here, shuffle values and repeating values, and it'll give you the sample value. So depending on what we choose, bitmap, Boolean, string, currency, color, date as a T-date time, or date as a string, or just date as a date and time. Lots of different types, integers, path data, and so on. And there's generators that'll generate the values. And again, it shows you a sample value down here, what the type is for each one. So let's just pick a few. We want to have some strings and maybe a color. Let's just pick a few of these. And now we've got some data. We've got some strings here. We've got some bitmaps, some Boolean field with data checked or not checked, a color value, a name, some currency field, date field. And we can add additional fields. Maybe we need a floating point value, and there's some floating point data. And then we can associate this label. Maybe it's the name field or a date field with this label. So depending on which row we're on, we're going to get the data associated with it. And let's add a second label. And we can associate that with another column, like this Boolean value, true or false. I'll run this application, and as we step through, notice all the live bindings that's happened. We can put an image up here and associate the image with our bitmap, so this bitmap here. Notice the live binding designer will say if it can't bind something, it'll put the little circle slash to say that doesn't make any sense, but this one does. Now we've got our bitmap here. And again, at runtime, it does the right thing. We get the right values, all being bound. And then at some point in time, we get the data set. Maybe it doesn't have colors, and maybe it doesn't have some other bits. We can add a SQL connection, and we can use a connection string to get to that data. And we can right mouse click, bring up the live binding designer, and say, let's create a data source. And we're going to create the data source from a data set. Let's log in, and it's the employee database. Let's do a table this time, and we can see all the different tables. So for example, maybe it's a department. Test the command. We don't want a navigator because we're going to reuse all the other bits. And now we have a data source to go along with our PrototypeBindSource. And the department is here. Now to connect up the grid, we just say, let's take the department and connect it to the grid. And it'll say delete link grid to data source 1. Yes. And now we've got department information showing up in our grid, but we still have that other data from the PrototypeBindSource. So if we want the first label to be the department name, we can link that. Let's go and make that fit better. And the second label, let's get the department number. And there's department number. And this image didn't make sense, so let's just make it invisible. And we have to link up the navigator. So let's link up the navigator. Now when we run our application, we've got department information, department numbers, and the name of the department. So you can start with a PrototypeBindSource, give it some data types that match maybe the data definition of your application, and then connect up the data set and do all of that in the Visual Live Bindings Designer. Of course, you can always write code to connect up everything. But in this case, you can do quite a bit in your C++ applications at design time, just by connecting the actual data set to the different parts of your user interface instead of the prototype bind source where you had some prototype data. All in C++ Builder exe3 with the Live Binding Designer and the Live Bindings Wizard.